Racist judge thinks she's untouchable until a black defendant changes everything. You're an architect, Mr. Wright. Tell me, how exactly did you plan to rebuild your life after destroying the Wellington Exchange? Judge Grace Sterling's voice sliced through the breathless courtroom. Miles stood tall, fingers gripping the defense table. I didn't destroy anything, Your Honor. I am innocent. Grace offered a chilling, paper-thin smile. Innocence is a privilege reserved for those who actually belong in my city. You are a threat. Bail is categorically denied. Make no mistake, Mr. Wright in this courtroom, your kind will always receive exactly what they deserve. The 4th District Courthouse was a monolithic structure of gray stone and heavily varnished mahogany, designed specifically to make anyone who entered feel incredibly small. For Judge Grace Sterling, however, it was a perfectly tailored throne room. She sat perched at her elevated bench like a hawk, surveying a field of mice. At 55, Grace was the picture of terrifying, aristocratic elegance. Her silver hair was coiffed into a rigid bob that never moved, framing a face composed of sharp angles and a perpetually judgmental stare. To Grace, the justice system wasn't about equity. It was a dam built to hold back the floodwaters of what she deemed the undesirable elements of society. She genuinely believed her gavel was the only thing standing between civil high society and total urban decay. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the murmur of the gallery died instantly. It was time for State v. Miles Wright. Miles Wright walked to the defense table with a measured, deliberate stride. At 32, he was a physically imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, but he carried himself with the quiet, meticulous grace of a man who spent his life designing load-bearing structures. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a subtle geometric tie. He was an award-winning independent structural architect, a man who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, paid his way through Columbia University, and built a boutique firm that was highly sought after in the city's commercial district. But today, the state had decided to reclassify him. Today, he was merely inmate 409B. Standing beside him was Scott Lewis, a defense attorney whose rumpled gray suits belied a razor-sharp legal mind. Scott had spent 2 decades throwing himself against the brick wall of Grace Sterling's courtroom, and he knew exactly what kind of uphill battle they were facing. "State your appearances for the record," Grace demanded, barely looking up from the manila folder before her. "Scott Lewis for the defense, Your Honor," Scott said, his voice projecting clearly. Assistant District Attorney Brianna Hayes approached the prosecution's podium. Brianna was 30, brilliant, and harboring a growing ulcer from working under a district attorney who cared more about conviction rates than actual justice. She swallowed hard, feeling the immense weight of Judge Sterling's expectant gaze. "Brianna Hayes for the state, Your Honor. We are here on a motion for bail regarding the charges of grand larceny, breaking and entering, and aggravated assault." "And the state's position, Miss Hayes?" Grace asked, her tone already laced with predetermined agreement. "Your Honor, the state strongly requests remand without bail," Brianna recited, hating the words as they left her mouth. The defendant was apprehended at the scene of the Wellington Jewelry Exchange during a $3 million diamond heist. Given the sheer financial magnitude of the crime and the assault on the security guard, we believe Mr. Wright possesses the means and motive to be a severe flight risk. Scott practically vaulted out of his chair. "Objection to the state's wild narrative, Your Honor. My client was not apprehended trying to flee. Mr. Wright was contracted by the Wellington Exchange to conduct a midnight seismic structural review of the sub-basement vault after the recent subway expansions. He was legally on the premises. When the alarm sounded, my client was the one who dialed 911. He waited on the curb for the police to arrive. This isn't a flight risk. This is a model citizen caught in a spectacular police blunder." Grace finally lowered her reading glasses, her icy blue eyes locking onto Miles. She did not see an Ivy League graduate. She did not see a successful business owner. In the deep, rotting core of her worldview, she saw a black man in a suit trying to outsmart a system designed to keep him in his place. "Mr. Lewis," You have a remarkable talent for spinning fairy tales, Grace said, her voice dripping with a condescension so thick it suffocated the room. Are you honestly asking this court to believe that a man of his specific demographic just happened to be standing outside a vault while $3 million in loose diamonds walked out the back door? I am asking the court to look at his spotless record. Scott fired back, slamming his hand on the table. He owns a home in the Heights. He employs 12 people. His wife, Sophie, is sitting in the front row, 6 months pregnant with their first child. He is an architect, Your Honor, not a cat burglar. In the front row, Sophie Wright let out a stifled, trembling breath. She was dressed in a conservative beige maternity dress, her hands tightly gripping a leather handbag. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying all night, but she stared fiercely at her husband, trying to project a courage she didn't feel. Miles turned his head slightly, catching her eye, his own expression breaking for just a fraction of a second to reveal the sheer terror beneath his stoic facade. Grace noticed the exchange. The sight of the loving, affluent, successful black couple did not humanize Miles to her. It enraged her. It felt like an insult to the natural order of her world. Ties to the community can be easily severed when facing 20 years in state prison, counsel, Grace said smoothly, adjusting the microphone in front of her. And a tailored suit does not erase the statistical realities of violent crime in this city. This court has a fundamental duty to protect its citizens from individuals who pose a clear and present danger. A security guard is currently in a coma, and millions of dollars are missing. There is zero physical evidence linking him to the assault, Scott argued, his face flushing red. The court has heard enough, Grace snapped, her hand reaching for her wooden gavel. The defendant was present at a violent crime scene. I will not allow my city's streets to be treated as a playground for thugs pretending to be professionals. Bail is categorically denied. The defendant is remanded to the county detention center pending trial. Crack. The gavel hit the sounding block. Your Honor, please. Miles stepped forward, his composure finally cracking. I am innocent. You haven't even looked at the building logs. Silence. Mr. Wright, or I will add contempt to your mounting list of problems, Grace hissed. Bailiffs, remove the prisoner. 2 heavy-set court officers flanked Miles, aggressively grabbing his arms. As they jerked him backward toward the holding cell door, Sophie couldn't hold back anymore. She stood up, tears spilling over her cheeks. Miles, we'll fight this. I love you. Take care of the baby. Call the firm. Miles shouted back over his shoulder, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls before the heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting him off from the world he had built. Grace Sterling simply picked up her pen, checked a box on a form, and coldly called for the next file, already erasing Miles Wright from her conscience. The transition from a life of autonomy to a life of absolute subjugation happens in a matter of hours. For Miles Wright, the intake process at the county detention facility was an exercise in systematic humiliation. He was ordered to strip under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights while a bored corrections officer cataloged his wedding ring, his watch, and his tailored clothes. He was sprayed down, handed an abrasive, oversized neon orange jumpsuit, and marched barefoot down a long, echoing corridor that smelled permanently of rust, sweat, and despair. When the heavy iron grate of cell block C slammed locked behind him, the sound vibrated in his teeth. Miles sat on a razor-thin mattress atop a cold steel slab, burying his face in his hands. He thought about the architectural blueprints sitting on his drafting table back home. He thought about the smell of Sophie's lavender shampoo. The psychological whiplash was so violent it made him physically nauseous. He was a builder, a creator of structures, and now he was trapped inside a concrete box designed to break men down to nothing. 48 hours later, the heavy door of a cramped, windowless attorney visitation room clicked open. Scott Lewis walked in, dropping a massive accordion file onto the scratched metal table. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, and a 5 o'clock shadow darkening his jaw. Miles, Scott breathed, taking a seat across from him. How are you holding up in here? Miles looked up. The vibrant, confident man who had stood in the courtroom 2 days ago looked hollowed out. It's a nightmare, Scott. The noise never stops. But worse than that, it's the feeling. Grace Sterling looked at me, and I knew it didn't matter what you said. She had convicted me before I even walked through the door. She is a deeply prejudiced woman who knows exactly how to weaponize the bench, Scott said, his voice low and angry. She caters to a very wealthy, very white, very conservative donor base in this district. She uses high-profile minority defendants as political props to prove she's tough on urban crime. You are a trophy for her, Miles. A way to show the country club set that no one is beyond her reach. What about Sophie? Miles asked, his voice cracking. Please tell me she's okay. Scott's expression softened. Sophie is incredible, Miles. She's terrified, but she is fighting like hell. But I have to be honest with you. The fallout is hitting the firm hard. The news cycle ran with Sterling's thug in a suit narrative. Two of your biggest commercial developers pulled their contracts this morning. They invoked the morality clause. Your accounts are freezing up. Miles closed his eyes, a tear escaping and tracking down his cheek. Everything he had worked for a decade to build was being dismantled by a single prejudiced judge. Meanwhile, across town at the district attorney's office, ADA Brianna Hayes was sitting at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. The police file for State v. Wright was open in front of her. The more she read it, the more her stomach churned. The entire case hinged on the testimony of Vance, the Wellington Exchange night manager. Vance claimed he was struck from behind, woke up groggy, and saw a tall black man in dark clothing rushing out of the vault. But Brianna had seen the crime scene photos. Miles Wright had been wearing a light gray, almost white, suit. He hadn't been running. He had been standing calmly by the curb with his cell phone out, waiting for the sirens. Furthermore, there was no dust, no drywall, and no vault grease on Miles's clothes or hands. Her office door swung shut with a click. Scott Lewis stood there, his arms crossed. You shouldn't be in here, Scott, Brianna said, though she didn't make a move to call security. And you shouldn't be prosecuting an innocent man, Brianna. But here we are, Scott countered, walking over and planting his hands firmly on her desk. Look at me. You know this case is garbage. The police rushed it because the Wellingtons demanded an immediate arrest, and Sterling demanded a scapegoat. Brianna sighed, rubbing her temples. Scott, the physical description is a generic racial profile given by a guy who had a concussion. Scott interrupted. Vance didn't see Miles. He saw his own bias. And where are the diamonds, Brianna? $3 million in stones don't just vanish into thin air. Miles's car was searched. His home was searched. Nothing. Because he didn't do it. Brianna looked down at her hands. Sterling personally called the DA. She explicitly asked for me to handle this, and she wants a trial date set within the month. If I go to my boss and tell him I want to drop the charges against the man Judge Sterling just publicly crucified, I will be fired by sunset. I have student loans, Scott. I have a career. Is your career worth a man's life? Scott asked softly, leaning in. Is it worth a father missing his child's birth to sit in a maximum security cage? I know you, Brianna. You went into law to find the truth. The truth is screaming at you right now. Don't let Grace Sterling turn you into one of her monsters. Scott left the office, leaving the door slightly ajar. Brianna sat alone in the silence of the DA's office, the weight of the justice system pressing down on her chest. She looked at the photo of Miles Wright in his gray suit, then at the hospital photo of the comatose guard. The scales of justice were rigged, and she was suddenly terrified of what would happen if she tried to balance them. The Sapphire Room atop the Street Regis Hotel was a glittering sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and the quiet, dangerous hum of immense wealth. It was the annual Justice and Law Endowment Gala. At the epicenter of the room stood Judge Grace Sterling. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown that accentuated her severe features. A polite, aristocratic smile painted onto her face as she accepted the fawning adoration of the city's elite. Grace, my dear, you are an absolute savior, said Richard Wellington, stepping into her orbit. Wellington was a billionaire with a ruddy face and a perpetually entitled demeanor. He owned the Wellington Jewelry Exchange, along with half the real estate in the commercial district. Grace clinked her champagne flute delicately against his. "It is merely my job to maintain order, Richard. We cannot have savages roaming our financial sectors masquerading as professionals." Wellington nodded fervently. It was terrifying. My son, Julian, was supposed to be doing inventory that night. Thank God he left early. To think what that right animal might have done to him. "You have my word, Richard," Grace said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, reassuring whisper. "The DA is fast-tracking the trial. The bail denial was just the beginning. I will ensure that man is put away for so long he forgets what the sun looks like. Our city will remain safe for people like us." She felt a rush of absolute power. She was the architect of their reality. She was untouchable. 5 miles away, in a cramped, pizza box-littered law office, Scott Lewis was about to detonate a bomb under her entire world. It was 3:15 a.m. Scott's eyes were bloodshot, staring at a massive spreadsheet on his dual monitors. Frustrated by the DA's stonewalling, Scott had hired an independent cybersecurity firm to subpoena the raw, unfiltered digital ping logs from the Wellington Vault's alarm manufacturer, completely bypassing the local police precinct. He had been scrolling for 6 hours. Suddenly, he froze. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes, and leaned closer to the glowing screen. 11:42 and 4 seconds p.m. Vault inner door primary lock disengaged. 11:42 and 6 seconds p.m. Override code entered. Authorization 004. Scott's heart kicked into a violent rhythm. The police report stated the vault had been hot-wired or forced open. But this was a digital key. Someone had simply punched in a code and walked right in. He frantically pulled up the employee manifest he had demanded in discovery. He scanned down the list of executive authorization codes. 001, Richard Wellington. 002, Vance, manager. 003, head of security. 004, Julian Wellington. Scott let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. Julian Wellington, the billionaire's son. The same son known in the tabloids for his rampant cocaine habit and massive underground gambling debts. Miles Wright had been hired to inspect the vault at midnight, providing the perfect cover. Julian had used his own code, cleaned out the diamonds to pay off his bookies, bashed the security guard to make it look like a struggle, and fled, leaving the black architect to take the fall. By 8 a.m., Scott was storming the courthouse. He filed an emergency ex parte motion and demanded a meeting in Judge Sterling's private chambers. Grace sat behind her sprawling mahogany desk, sipping herbal tea from a china cup. Brianna Hayes sat nervously in a leather wingback chair. "This had better be a matter of life and death, Mr. Lewis," Grace said, not bothering to hide her disdain. "I do not appreciate ambush meetings before my morning docket." Scott slapped the thick stack of digital logs directly onto the center of her pristine desk. "It is a matter of absolute innocence, Your Honor. I have the raw security data from the vault manufacturer. The vault wasn't broken into. It was opened with an executive passkey, specifically, the passkey belonging to Julian Wellington." Brianna gasped, leaning forward to look at the papers. "Julian Wellington? The owner's son?" "Exactly," Scott said, his voice ringing with triumph. "It was an inside job. An insurance scam. My client was a patsy. I am moving for an immediate dismissal of all charges against Miles Wright with prejudice, and I expect him released from county custody within the hour." Grace stared at the paperwork. Her face did not change. Her pulse did not elevate. She slowly picked up her teacup, took a sip, and placed it back on the saucer with a quiet clink. "This is an interesting theory, Mr. Lewis," Grace said softly, "but it is nothing more than digital noise. A glitch in an alarm system." Scott stared at her, horrified. "A glitch? It's an encrypted timestamp, Your Honor. It is definitive proof that Julian Wellington was inside that vault. It is proof that a computer registered a code," Grace corrected, her voice turning to ice. "Perhaps a hacker spoofed the code. Perhaps your client, with all his architectural knowledge, found a way to bypass the system and trigger that specific numeric sequence to frame the Wellington boy. The Wellingtons are pillars of this community. I will not have their name dragged through the mud based on a desperate defense attorney's science fiction. You have got to be kidding me, Scott breathed, stepping back. He looked at Brianna, desperate. Brianna, you see this? This is exculpatory evidence. Brianna opened her mouth, her heart pounding, but Grace cut her off instantly. The state sees nothing but an unverified printout. Isn't that right, Miss Hayes? Grace demanded, her eyes promising absolute career destruction if Brianna dared to speak out of turn. Brianna looked down at her lap. The state requires time to authenticate the documents, Your Honor. There you have it. Grace smiled smoothly. Motion to dismiss is denied. Bail remains denied. Save your little conspiracy theories for the jury, Mr. Lewis. Now, get out of my chambers before I have you arrested for trespassing. Scott slowly gathered his files. The sheer magnitude of her corruption was staggering. She wasn't just biased. She was actively participating in a cover-up to protect her wealthy, white friends at the expense of a black man's life. Scott stopped at the door, turning to look Grace dead in the eye. You think you're untouchable sitting behind that desk, Grace. But you just crossed a line from prejudice into criminal conspiracy. And I am going to tear your kingdom down brick by brick. Grace merely offered a cold, dismissive wave. Goodbye, Mr. Lewis. The torrential rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the district attorney's office mirrored the storm raging inside Assistant District Attorney Brianna Hayes. It was 9 p.m. on a Friday. The bullpen was deserted, the glow of her dual monitors the only light in the cavernous room. On the left screen was a photograph of Miles Wright, looking dignified and calm in his gray suit, taken just hours before his life was dismantled. On the right screen was the bruised, comatose face of Marcus Vance, the night guard at the Wellington Exchange. Brianna couldn't get Scott Lewis's words out of her head. Is your career worth a man's life? She clicked open the digital discovery file that Scott had tried to submit to Judge Sterling earlier that week, the file Grace had dismissed as digital noise. Brianna had secretly made a copy before handing the original back to the court clerk. As she stared at the timestamp 11:42 and 6 seconds p.m., override code entered. Authorization 004. A sickening realization settled in her gut. She had gone to law school to be a shield for the vulnerable, not a sword for the corrupt. Grace Sterling was using her as an executioner, and Brianna was holding the axe. Determined to find the truth, Brianna bypassed the official police report and logged directly into the city's central dispatch database. She pulled the GPS tracking logs for the first responding patrol cars on the night of the robbery. The police narrative stated that officers arrived, saw Miles attempting to flee, and apprehended him. But the GPS logs told a different story. The first cruiser arrived at 11:48 p.m., exactly 6 minutes after the vault was breached. The dashcam footage, which had been curiously omitted from the primary discovery folder, showed Miles Wright standing calmly on the sidewalk, holding an umbrella, waving the officers down. He hadn't run. He had directed them to the basement entrance. My God, Brianna whispered to the empty room. Scott was right. It's all a lie. Across the city, the reality of that lie was slowly suffocating Miles. The county detention center visiting room was a stark, depressing corridor, divided by thick, smudged plexiglass. Miles sat on a bolted metal stool, wearing the degrading orange jumpsuit that felt like a neon sign flashing his stolen dignity. The door on the civilian side opened, and Sophie walked in. Seeing her was a brutal paradox of profound joy and agonizing guilt. She looked exhausted. The elegant maternity dress she had worn to the bail hearing was replaced by a simple, comfortable sweater. But the stress had carved deep lines around her beautiful eyes. She sat down, picking up the heavy black telephone receiver. Miles picked up his side. Soph, you shouldn't have come. This place, it's not safe for you. Not for the baby. I am exactly where I need to be, Miles, Sophie said, her voice fierce, though her hands trembled as she pressed them against the glass. Miles raised his hand to meet hers, the cold, scratched plastic separating their warmth. I fired the PR firm. They wanted you to release a statement apologizing for a misunderstanding. I told them to go to hell. Scott is working around the clock. We are going to get you out. How is the firm? Miles asked, though the lump in his throat made it hard to speak. Did the Peterson account pull out? Sophie looked down, a silent confirmation. It doesn't matter. Buildings can be rebuilt. Miles. Businesses can be restarted. I just need my husband back. I need the father of my child. She looked up, tears finally spilling over. They treat you like an animal in there. I can see it in your eyes. Don't let her take your soul, Miles. Grace Sterling wants you to break. You cannot give her that satisfaction. I'm trying, Soph, Miles whispered, his broad shoulders slumping. But she's the judge. She's the gatekeeper. She looked at me, and all she saw was a target. She's protecting the people who actually did this. And I don't know how we beat a rigged system. By exposing it, a voice echoed in his memory Scott Lewis's promise. Back at the courthouse the next morning, Brianna Hayes made a decision that would either save her soul or end her career. She requested the physical evidence box for the Wellington case from the basement lockup. Among the bagged items was the uniform worn by Marcus Vance, the assaulted guard. Brianna snapped on a pair of latex gloves and carefully spread the navy blue jacket on the sterile metal table. Vance claimed he was attacked from behind by a tall black man. But as Brianna examined the collar of the jacket under a high-intensity lamp, she noticed something the rushed crime scene investigators had missed. Embedded in the fibers near the collarbone, precisely where an attacker's arm would have locked around Vance's neck, were a few tiny, coarse strands of pale blonde hair, along with a faint smudge of white powder. Miles Wright had close-cropped black hair. Julian Wellington, however, was notoriously blonde. And the white powder? A quick field test kit Brianna snagged from the narcotics desk confirmed her suspicion. It was high-grade cocaine. Brianna bagged the hair and the test swab, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't just dealing with a biased judge. She was dealing with a systemic cover-up engineered to protect a billionaire's son at the cost of an innocent man's life. She pulled out her personal cell phone, bypassing her monitored work line, and dialed a number she had sworn to her boss she would never call. Scott, Brianna said when the gruff defense attorney answered. We need to talk. Off the record. Off the grid. Tonight. Diner 42 was a greasy, forgotten establishment on the absolute edge of the city limits. A place illuminated by a flickering, half-dead neon sign. It was the last place anyone from the 4th District Courthouse would ever be caught dead in, which made it the perfect meeting spot. Scott Lewis was already sitting in a corner booth, nursing a black coffee, when Brianna walked in. She wore a hooded raincoat, casting nervous glances over her shoulder before sliding into the vinyl seat across from him. I thought you were going to play the good soldier, Brianna, Scott said softly, noting her pale, terrified expression. Brianna reached into her oversized tote bag and slid a thick manila envelope across the sticky table. I am a good soldier, Scott, but I serve the law, not Grace Sterling. Open it. Scott opened the envelope. Inside were the dashcam stills, the GPS dispatch logs, and a high-resolution photograph of the blonde hair and cocaine residue Brianna had found on the guard's collar. Scott's eyes widened as he flipped through the evidence. You found this in lockup? Scott asked, his voice a mixture of awe and anger. The cops had this the whole time? The cops were told to wrap the case with a bow by Monday morning because Richard Wellington called the mayor, who called the DA, Brianna explained, her voice trembling slightly. Grace Sterling is the enforcer. She makes sure any legal hiccups are smoothed over on the bench. Scott, if I bring this to my boss, he will bury it. He will bury me. So why give it to me? Scott asked, looking at her intently. If Sterling finds out you leaked this, she will have you disbarred and thrown in a cell next to Miles. Because I saw Sophie Wright in the hallway crying, Brianna said, her voice cracking. Because I looked at the logs, and I realized Julian Wellington used his father's company as a piggy bank to pay off his cartel debts. And Grace Sterling is perfectly happy to let an innocent, brilliant architect rot in prison because his skin color fits her convenient narrative. I can't live with that. But Scott, this evidence isn't enough. Sterling will suppress it. She'll say the chain of custody was broken. We need a confession. We need to trap them. We need to squeeze Julian, Scott said, his legal mind racing. Julian is weak. He's an addict playing gangster. If we rattle his cage hard enough, he'll panic. And when he panics, he'll run to Daddy. And Daddy will run to Grace. We need a wire, Brianna suggested. No, a wire is inadmissible without a warrant, and we'll never get a warrant past Sterling, Scott countered. We need to force them to commit a crime in broad daylight. We need Grace Sterling to overplay her hand on the official court record. The alliance was forged in the smell of stale fries and cheap coffee. It was dangerous, reckless, and their only hope. The next afternoon, the atmosphere in Judge Sterling's courtroom was oppressive. Grace sat upon her bench, dispatching cases with a bored, lethal efficiency. When a recess was called, she summoned Brianna into her private chambers. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut. Grace poured herself a glass of sparkling water, not offering one to Brianna. Miss Hayes, Grace began, her voice a terrifying purr. I had a very interesting conversation with the chief of evidence lockup this morning. He mentioned you were down there yesterday, pawing through the Wellington files. Without a detective present, Brianna's blood ran cold, but she forced her posture to remain rigid. I was doing my due diligence as the prosecuting attorney, Your Honor. Preparing for trial, due diligence is commendable, Grace said, stepping closer, her icy blue eyes boring into Brianna. But curiosity is dangerous. The right case is a slam dunk. The narrative is set. The city is happy. Richard Wellington is happy. You are a very bright young woman, with a long, lucrative career ahead of you. It would be a profound tragedy if you were to suddenly find yourself unemployable because you decided to play detective and muddy the waters. It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. I understand perfectly, Your Honor, Brianna lied smoothly. Good. Grace smiled. A terrifying stretch of facial muscles. Ensure Mr. Wright's conviction is swift. I want him transferred to the state penitentiary before the month is out. Dismissed. Brianna left the chambers, her heart pounding. Grace Sterling thought she was untouchable. She thought she had the young ADA terrified into submission. But as Brianna walked down the marble hallway, she didn't feel fear anymore. She felt rage. Grace had just given her the exact motivation she needed to burn the fortress to the ground. The Velvet Room was an exclusive, underground, members-only club where the city's trust fund elite went to snort away their inheritances. The air was thick with cigar smoke, expensive perfume, and the heavy thumping of a muffled bass line. Julian Wellington sat at a high-stakes poker table, sweating profusely. He was 25, rail-thin, with pale skin, expensive clothes, and the twitchy, paranoid energy of a man who owed money to very bad people. He tossed a stack of chips into the center of the table, his hand shaking slightly. Fold, the man across from him grunted. Julian exhaled, raking in the chips. Before his hands could reach the pile, a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. Julian jumped, spinning around. Standing over him was Scott Lewis, wearing a cheap suit that looked wildly out of place in the opulent room. Julian Wellington, Scott said, his voice a low, gravelly threat. Having a good night? Spending the insurance payout, or did you fence the diamonds already? Julian's face drained of color. Who the hell are you? Security? I'm Miles Wright's attorney. Scott leaned in, his mouth inches from Julian's ear. I know about Executive Code 004, Julian. I know you were in the vault at 11:42 p.m. I have the digital logs. And more importantly, I have the blonde hair and the cocaine swab pulled directly off Marcus Vance's uniform collar. Julian stopped breathing. His eyes darted frantically around the room. You're lying. The cops are building a federal RICO case against you as we speak. Scott bluffed brilliantly, leveraging the kid's paranoia. Miles Wright isn't taking the fall for your gambling debts, Julian. I'm taking this to the grand jury on Monday. Enjoy the weekend. It's your last one as a free man. Scott released Julian's shoulder and walked out of the club, leaving the young billionaire in a state of absolute, shattering panic. Just as Scott predicted, Julian didn't go to the police. He ran straight to the bathroom, locked himself in a stall, and aggressively dialed his father. "Dad, Dad, you have to help me." Julian sobbed into the phone. "That lawyer, the black guy's lawyer, he was just here. He knows. He has logs. He has hair off the guard. Dad, he's going to the grand jury." Richard Wellington, sitting in his penthouse, felt his chest tighten. "Calm down, Julian. Do not say another word. I will handle it. I will make a call." Within 10 minutes, Judge Grace Sterling's private cell phone buzzed. She answered it on her balcony, overlooking the glittering skyline of the city she believed she owned. "Richard, it is late," Grace said, annoyed. "We have a problem, Grace." Richard's voice was sharp with panic. "That lawyer, Lewis. He ambushed Julian. He claims to have evidence tying Julian to the incident. He mentioned a grand jury." Grace's grip on the phone tightened. Scott Lewis was proving to be a cockroach she couldn't crush. "That is impossible. The ADA assured me the case is secure. Lewis is bluffing to rattle your boy." "I don't pay you to guess if he's bluffing, Grace." Richard snapped, abandoning his usual polite deference. "If my son goes down, he takes the company down. And if the company goes down, who do you think funded your last 3 election campaigns? Fix this, now." The line went dead. Grace stood in the cold night air, her aristocratic mask slipping into a sneer of pure rage. She marched back into her study and opened her secure judicial terminal. If Scott Lewis was preparing to file a motion with new evidence, he would have to submit it to the clerk of courts. Grace bypassed standard protocol. She logged into the central database using her chief administrative judge override codes. She searched for any pending filings under State v. Wright or Wellington. She found nothing. But she did find a grand jury subpoena request, drafted but not yet filed, by Ada Brianna Hayes, requesting the cellular geolocation data of Julian Wellington for the night of the robbery. Brianna had betrayed her. Blinded by arrogance and the absolute belief in her own invincibility, Grace made a fatal error. She digitally deleted the subpoena request from the ADA's outbox. Then, using her judicial authority, she issued an illegal, retroactive gag order sealing all police records, digital logs, and physical evidence related to the Wellington exchange, sealing them under a bogus national security and ongoing cartel investigation clause. She thought she was building an impenetrable wall. She didn't realize that Brianna and Scott, sitting side by side in Scott's office, were watching her do it in real time. Brianna had purposely left the draft on an unencrypted, monitored server, setting a digital tripwire. "She took the bait," Brianna whispered, staring at the screen as the deletion logs registered Judge Sterling's unique IP address. "She just illegally destroyed a grand jury document and manipulated evidence logs. It's a felony." Scott smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "She thinks she's a god. But tonight, we just proved she's a criminal. It's time to bring the untouchable Judge Sterling down to earth." Monday morning arrived with a suffocating, overcast gloom that seemed perfectly tailored for the 4th District Courthouse. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with local reporters, curious law clerks, and the city's elite, all gathered to watch what had been billed as the swift, righteous conviction of a brazen criminal. In the front row, directly behind the prosecution's table, sat Richard Wellington. He wore a bespoke Italian suit, his posture exuding the untouchable arrogance of a man who believed his wealth could purchase reality itself. He leaned over, whispering a joke to a fellow socialite, entirely unconcerned that he had just condemned an innocent man to ruin. On the opposite side of the aisle sat Sophie Wright. She was pale, her hands resting protectively over her pregnant belly, her eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door leading to the holding cells. When the door finally clicked open, the breath caught in her throat. Miles was led out by 2 burly bailiffs. The state had not allowed him to change into his tailored suit. Instead, they forced him to appear before the jury pool in his bright orange, oversized county jumpsuit, his wrists bound by heavy steel chains that clinked against his waist with every step. It was a calculated psychological tactic, designed by Judge Sterling to strip him of his humanity before the trial even began. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes speaking of sleepless nights on a steel slab. But as he locked eyes with Sophie, his jaw tightened with quiet, unyielding defiance. Scott Lewis patted Miles on the shoulder as he sat down. "Keep your head up," Scott whispered, his voice vibrating with a dangerously calm energy. "The play is set. All rise." The bailiff bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The 4th District Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Grace Sterling presiding. Grace Sterling emerged from her private chambers like a dark monarch ascending her throne. She wore her black robe like armor, her silver hair immaculate, her posture terrifyingly rigid. She took her seat at the elevated mahogany bench, looking down her nose at the courtroom. When her eyes fell upon Miles and his chains, a faint, deeply satisfied smirk played at the corner of her lips. The system was working exactly as she designed it. The undesirables were in chains, and the wealthy were in the gallery. "Be seated," Grace commanded, her voice slicing through the room's murmur. She arranged her files meticulously. "We are here for the commencement of State v. Miles Wright. Is the state ready to present its opening statement to the jury pool?" Assistant District Attorney Brianna Hayes stood up. Her hands, usually trembling in this courtroom, were remarkably steady. She looked at Judge Sterling, then over at Richard Wellington, and finally down at the files on her desk. She didn't pick them up. "Your Honor," Brianna began, her voice ringing out clear and sharp, carrying to the very back of the gallery. "The state will not be presenting an opening statement today. In fact, the state moves to immediately dismiss all charges against Miles Wright with extreme prejudice." A collective, stunned gasp rippled through the gallery. Richard Wellington shot up in his seat, his face flushing violently red. Miles turned his head, staring at Brianna in absolute shock, while Scott merely leaned back in his chair, a small, knowing smile creeping onto his face. Grace Sterling's gavel cracked down with a deafening bang. "Order, Miss Hayes. I suggest you rethink your words very carefully. This court does not entertain theatrical stunts. You will proceed with your opening statement, or I will replace you with a prosecutor who knows how to do their job." "I am doing my job, Your Honor," Brianna said. Stepping out from behind the podium, she walked into the center of the courtroom. "Over the weekend, I uncovered undeniable, exculpatory physical evidence proving Mr. Wright's complete innocence. Furthermore, the state has obtained digital logs proving that Julian Wellington bypassed the vault security system using his own executive code." "Objection!" Richard Wellington roared from the gallery, completely ignoring courtroom protocol. "This is slander. Arrest her. Bailiff, remove Mr. Wellington if he speaks again," Grace snapped, though her icy facade was beginning to show microscopic cracks of panic. She turned her venomous gaze onto Brianna. "Miss Hayes, I warned you about pursuing fabricated digital glitches. And I recall signing a specific gag order late Friday night sealing all such evidence pending a national security review. By speaking of this, you are in direct violation of a court order. With all due respect, Your Honor." Scott Lewis stood up, his booming voice taking command of the room. "That gag order is a fraudulent, retroactive document intended to cover up a felony. You didn't sign it until 11:45 p.m. on Friday. We know this because Miss Hayes and I were actively monitoring the server when you logged in using your chief administrative override." Grace's face went bone white. The courtroom descended into a hushed, terrified silence. No one spoke to Judge Sterling this way. No one challenged her absolute authority. "You are both in contempt of court," Grace shrieked, her composure shattering into desperate rage. She hammered her gavel furiously against the sounding block. "Bailiffs, place Mr. Lewis and Miss Hayes in handcuffs immediately. This trial is suspended. You can't suspend this, Grace." Scott fired back, dropping the formalities. "Because we didn't just log your IP address. We watched you digitally delete a grand jury subpoena targeting Julian Wellington from the district attorney's outbox. We watched you destroy federal evidence logs. You didn't build a legal firewall. You left a digital confession. Lies. Grace screamed, standing up behind her bench, pointing a trembling finger at Scott. I am the law in this city. I am untouchable. Bailiffs, I said, arrest them. The court officers took a hesitant step forward, torn between the screaming judge and the two attorneys who had just accused her of a massive criminal conspiracy. But before anyone could lay a hand on Scott or Brianna, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, hitting the wooden walls with a thunderous crash that silenced the entire room. 6 men and women in dark windbreakers, the letters FBI emblazoned in bright yellow across their backs, marched down the center aisle. Their boots echoed ominously against the polished marble floor. They bypassed the gallery entirely, moving with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. What is the meaning of this? Grace Sterling demanded, her voice cracking, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of her mahogany bench. This is a state courtroom. You have no jurisdiction here. Get out of my courtroom immediately. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with graying temples and eyes completely devoid of sympathy, stopped right before the defense table. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, folded document. Judge Grace Sterling, the agent said, his voice loud enough for the court reporters to catch every single syllable. I am Special Agent Thorne, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit. We have a federal warrant for your arrest. The gallery erupted into absolute pandemonium. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones. Law clerks stood with their mouths agape. Richard Wellington, realizing the catastrophic reality of the situation, slowly tried to edge his way toward the side exit. Stop that man, Agent Thorne commanded without even looking back. 2 agents instantly intercepted Wellington, grabbing his arms and forcing him against the wood-paneled wall. Richard Wellington, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, evidence tampering, and bribing a judicial official. Your son, Julian, was apprehended at the airport 20 minutes ago trying to board a flight to non-extradition territory. Wellington sputtered, his face a mask of panicked rage. Do you know who I am? I own half this city. I'll have your badges. You own a jail cell now, Richard, Scott Lewis said coldly, watching as the billionaire was locked into heavy steel handcuffs and dragged out of the courtroom. Agent Thorne turned his attention back to the bench. Grace Sterling was frozen, staring at the warrant in the agent's hand, as if it were a venomous snake. Her mind, usually a steel trap of legal maneuvering and calculated bigotry, was completely blank. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was the gatekeeper. She was the one who handed down sentences, not the one who received them. This is absurd, Grace whispered, her voice stripped of all its commanding power. She looked at Brianna, her eyes pleading for a terrifying second. Miss Hayes, tell them I have judicial immunity. I was acting within the scope of my administrative duties. Brianna looked up at the woman who had terrorized her, who had tried to force her to ruin an innocent man's life simply because of the color of his skin. Brianna's posture was flawless. Deleting a grand jury subpoena to protect a wealthy donor's son is not a judicial act, Grace. It's a federal felony. I sent the server logs to the FBI on Friday night. It's over. Step down from the bench, Miss Sterling, Agent Thorne ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Grace didn't move. She couldn't. To step down meant relinquishing the throne she had used to terrorize the marginalized for a decade. It meant descending into the very pit she had so gleefully thrown men like Miles Wright into. I am a judge, she repeated, almost deliriously, clutching the wooden edges of her desk. I am untouchable. Not anymore, Thorne said. He gestured to 2 of his agents. They bypassed the bailiffs, walked up the side steps, and approached the bench. One of the agents firmly grabbed Grace by the arm, prying her fingers off the wood. For the first time in her life, Grace Sterling felt the cold, unforgiving bite of steel as handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around her wrists, binding her hands behind her back. As the agents led her down from the elevated platform, Her perfectly styled silver hair fell slightly out of place. The walk from the bench to the center aisle felt like 1,000 miles. She had to walk past the defense table. She had to walk past Miles Wright. Miles stood up, his own chains still dangling, but his posture was that of a free man. He looked down at the disgraced, handcuffed judge. He didn't gloat. He didn't scream. He simply looked at her with pity. "You told me a suit couldn't hide who I really was, Judge," Miles said, his voice quiet but echoing in the stunned silence of the room. "You were right. I'm a builder. But it looks like that black robe couldn't hide who you really are, either." Grace Sterling dropped her gaze to the floor, humiliated, stripped of her power, and exposed as a deeply corrupt bigot before the entire city. She was marched out of the very doors she had used to banish so many innocent souls. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, sounding exactly like a gavel falling for the final time. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of profound relief and legal correction. A substitute administrative judge was rushed into the courtroom within the hour. Reviewing the FBI's preliminary findings and ADA Brianna Hayes' formal motion, the judge immediately dismissed all charges against Miles Wright with extreme prejudice. "Remove those chains immediately," the new judge ordered the bailiff. When the heavy steel cuffs fell to the floor, Miles let out a breath he felt he had been holding for weeks. He turned around. Sophie had pushed past the wooden partition, tears streaming down her face. Miles caught her in a desperate, bone-crushing embrace, burying his face in her shoulder as he finally let himself cry. "We're going home," he whispered into her hair, holding her and their unborn child tighter than ever before. "We're going home, Soph." Scott Lewis stood nearby, packing his battered leather briefcase. Brianna walked over to him, looking exhausted but lighter than she had in years. "You burned your bridge with the DA's office, you know," Scott pointed out, though a smile played on his lips. Brianna shrugged. "The DA is under federal investigation for turning a blind eye to Sterling's dockets. I think I'll be fine. In fact, I might just run for his seat next cycle." Scott laughed, extending his hand. "If you do, you've got my vote, Hayes." 6 months later, the city's legal landscape was unrecognizable. The Wellington Jewelry Exchange had filed for bankruptcy under the weight of massive civil lawsuits and federal asset freezing. Richard Wellington was serving a 10-year sentence in a medium-security federal prison, his empire reduced to ashes. Julian, terrified of the general population, had taken a plea deal that still netted him 15 years for armed robbery, assault, and narcotics trafficking. But the hardest, most poetic karma belonged to Grace Sterling. The woman who had once ruled the 4th District from a mahogany throne now resided in the exact same county detention facility she had remanded Miles Wright to. Stripped of her federal pensions, disbarred, and publicly disgraced, she sat in a tiny, 8x10 concrete cell. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights offered no mercy. She wore an abrasive, oversized orange jumpsuit. When the heavy iron grate of her cell door slid open for her allotted 1 hour of recreation, Grace stepped out into the dreary, gray corridor. The other inmates, many of whom she had personally sentenced with vicious, racially motivated maximum penalties, stared at her with cold, unforgiving eyes. There were no country club friends here to clink champagne glasses with. There was no gavel to hide behind. She was completely, utterly isolated. She had built a fortress of prejudice, and she was now condemned to die in its basement. Across the city, beneath a brilliant, cloudless sky, Miles Wright stood on a bustling construction site. He wore a hard hat and a crisp white button-down shirt, holding a massive roll of architectural blueprints. The firm hadn't just recovered, it had exploded. The massive public vindication and the subsequent multi-million-dollar wrongful prosecution settlement had allowed Miles to expand his business beyond his wildest dreams. He unrolled the blueprints on a makeshift table, pointing out load-bearing pillars to his site foreman. As he spoke, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a picture message from Sophie. The image showed their beautiful, healthy 3-month-old daughter, Maya, sleeping peacefully in her crib, a tiny pink fist curled near her cheek. Miles smiled. A deep, soul-warming expression. He looked up at the skeletal steel beams of the new skyscraper he was building. It was going to be a community center and affordable housing complex in the very district Grace Sterling had tried to gentrify and destroy. He was taking the broken pieces of the city and building something beautiful, strong, and enduring. They had tried to break his spirit, but they had only forged his resolve. He was free, he was a father, and he was rebuilding his world, one brick at a time. In the end, the corrupt system Judge Grace Sterling sought to manipulate became the exact instrument of her absolute downfall. She believed her gavel could bend reality, rewrite the truth, and bury an innocent man like Miles Wright based purely on her hateful prejudice. But true justice is a fiercely resilient force. It cannot be permanently silenced by wealth, nor locked away behind mahogany doors. Miles's harrowing journey from a wrongfully chained defendant to a triumphant father and builder proves that unwavering integrity always outlasts systemic corruption. Karma eventually collects all its debts, proving no one is truly untouchable. If you enjoyed this intense story of righteous karma and justice served, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more.